So good morning or good afternoon. I want to welcome all of you to our latest Effective Virtual Conversations call. I'm Jennifer Britton, and it is August the 14th, 2017. Today's topic is the third in our series on different virtual platforms. And here we are 2 weeks out of launch. It's been really exciting. Finally, my main copies of the new book arrived. It's actually started making its way to people all over the world. It's been interesting to see sort of where orders are coming in. And it looks like just as this topic is virtual, a lot of people are grabbing this book on Kindle as well as grabbing it on hard copy. If you've never met me before, nice to meet you. I'm so glad that you've joined us. In the next half an hour, I'm going to be going through one of the areas that the book focuses on. I wouldn't say that this is a primary focus, but it is certainly, I think, a consideration for all of us working in the virtual realm. I, of course, am Jennifer Britton, author of Effective Virtual Conversations. You may have met me before in some of my past books, those being Effective Group Coaching, which came out in 2009, and From One to Many, Best Practices for Team and Group Coaching. So this is our second August call. I'll be back in September with 2 more calls. They're usually held on a Monday morning. So if you can drop in and join us on Zoom, that's fantastic. If not, I hope you'll check them out on YouTube. Our call today, of course, is working on different platforms, and I want to give you a couple of tips for choosing different platforms, including some of the current options. I've actually, just to make this more of an evergreen recording, I have stripped out some of the current options just to make it a little bit more relevant to an environment which is constantly changing. So I hope that today you're going to really start to consider or maybe explore what is going to work best for the people you serve and your own platform needs as well. We really are in an era of just so many different options. And so in facilitating any sort of virtual conversation, whether it's a webinar or a virtual group or team coaching session, or maybe it's a conference call, we are faced not only with the platform, but also with the mechanisms on how to get things out. Today, I really am going to focus more on the platforms rather than the vehicles to get things out. Of course, those being things like tweeting and Facebooking and blogging. Today is truly focusing in on how do you make the conversation happen. And for those of you that have picked up a copy of the book already, Effective Virtual Conversations, what you'll want to follow along in is Appendix A, which is all about the different platform choices. What I've tried to do in this book is just highlight, at least as of April of this year, highlight a number of the more common platforms. No doubt this is going to change, so always refer to the main platform website for more up-to-date information. In the book, I really go into the fact that we have these formal and informal, there's a little typo, formal and informal ecosystem options, which vary across sort of a couple domains. Are they more peer-led or are they more individual? And what you would see, of course, is at the bottom is informal, things like coaching, team development, peer learning, moving through the continuum of approaches which are more formal in nature. So the upper x-axis should be marked formal. Things like e-learning, formal education, video-based learning. And my guess is for people who are listening in today, you probably find yourselves around this range. You might even be working on virtual mentoring or holding virtual meetings. I've been amazed in the last few months as I've started going out and speaking about this book, how many people have said, oh my goodness, I'm so glad that something is going to be available for us. We hold weekly conference calls and meetings and they're just not working. So in fact, chapter 9 of the book is focused solely on conference calls and virtual meetings. But regardless of the platform, we really want to, first of all, make sure that we are on the platform that's going to work best for our people. Now at the bottom, you're going to notice on the one side, we have more of the individual learner, and then we have more peer and collaborative approaches. And by all means, there is really a continuum here. The intent is to really help us figure out where are we on this continuum. Some of you listening are coaches, and so very much it's a co-designed conversation space each and every time, whether you are meeting once with a person or whether you're meeting multiple times with a team, for example. In coaching, we're always focusing in on helping people move into action around the goals that they have set, helping them gain awareness, and really having an ongoing touch point so that the conversation is grounded in accountability. That type of conversation is very different than others. If you follow along the bottom, some of you may be involved in virtual team development, maybe working with virtual teams across the globe, or maybe even more in peer learning environments. And certainly we've seen just an explosion in the last, I would say, decade with things like masterminds, coaching circles, breakouts, networking, and even action learning circles. In this 30-minute call, I'm not going to go into the nuances of all the ins and outs of the differences. For those interested, Chapter 4 of Effective Virtual Conversations is your go-to resource. In that chapter, I go through not only a little bit about the platforms, but more about these ecosystems, these different types of calls. And for those interested, you may also want to refer to an audio I did this spring of 2017, on the ecosystem where we looked at this. What I'd ask you to do right now is just zoom in to the areas that you might find yourselves working around. Maybe you are tasked with hosting conference calls. Maybe you are starting the journey of doing some e-learning or perhaps even video-based learning where you're bringing communities of learners together. Or maybe you are a coach and you're working on coaching. I'd like you just for a moment to bring to mind the type of program you're currently working on or looking to create, and that's going to help us as we move forward. So just take 20 seconds to think about who it is that you're working with and what you're looking to create. Now, depending on where you are, there are a few things that are different within this realm. And a lot of that is varying according to the pace of learning, the amount of interactivity, the level of connection and trust that's essential to form. And that's really going to be shaped in part by, group size and what the purpose is for the platform. So one of the key sort of principles I want you to think about as you move forward in your own programming is, what is the environment you want to create? I talk a lot more about this in the April 2017 community call, which you can download at a separate website. It's from one-to-many.com. Some programming, and I'm just going to go back to our ecosystem here, some programming is more individual in focus, coaching, mentoring, e-learning, where it's all about the learner. They are setting the pace, they are setting the approaches, they're engaging in the content at their own time. As we move along from left to right on the screen into the realm of peer learning, meetings, video-based learning, or even a lot of educational processes, it's no longer about the individual learner. We do want to really look at having platforms that bring groups together, bring voices together, and allow us to really deepen that connection and trust to help people learn. We want to bring diverse perspectives into the mix. And part of that in the virtual space is also making sure that we've got some visual anchor points or visual cues. As you think about what you are hoping to create, my guess is you're thinking about, okay, is this more of a formal process or informal? So going back to our ecosystem, and again, you can view the ecosystem if you're following along in the book, Chapter 4, you'll find the ecosystem, that's the square, which in an earlier iteration, of course, looked like a triangle. Page 111, you'll see an example of it. Formal versus informal. So, how important is it to be doing things like tracking participation? How important is it to be actually grading people? And if any of you have been involved in e-learning design like I have creating knowledge checks or having formal assessment processes, it adds a whole layer of complexity and work on for the facilitator, which is very different than more of an informal process. If you zoom down to the bottom row, things like in coaching, where it's not about me as a virtual facilitator assessing how far a person has moved in their action plan in coaching. It's about the individual learner being able to identify how far they've moved. So in looking at what our options are for the choice considerations, we do want to think about this element of, number one, formal versus informal. We secondly want to think about, is this an individual type of conversation or is this more of a peer-based conversation? So on one end of the continuum, we have our more traditional channels like phone, conference call, Skype, which have really evolved more initially as an individual channel versus a peer learning channel. So here we are on Zoom. Zoom is wonderful in terms of being an element where we can bring groups together, do breakout work, for example, and really have the focus not be on the educator at the front of the room, but rather on a peer conversation. A third consideration in looking at what are your options is the purpose of the call. Is this purpose to educate? Is it to facilitate? Is it to create a conversational environment? And having a good purpose of call, or being clear on what your purpose of call is, also going to help you in platform selection. A final consideration, of course, where we do see a lot of variability in terms of how easy it is for not only the facilitator but the end user to engage with, is the level of interactivity. And while I don't have stocks in this company, one of the reasons why I continue to put a lot of my programming here on Zoom is just the ease for the end user in terms of accessibility, in terms of following prompts and instructions, so to move to breakout, etc. So choice considerations are also very important. Now, interactivity, if we sort of follow along with like how interactive do we want to make this, we know that in in-person environments, every 7 to 10 minutes is sort of our norm. In the virtual domain, that interactivity element might be a little bit faster. And if you think about the early launch call I did a couple weeks ago, we were using chat, we were getting input all the time to get people interacting within the virtual domain. So you will really want to think about things like, can I incorporate annotation? And for anyone who is experienced, we would know that, sometimes it's a really good thing to get people to be writing on the screen. It really can boost engagement. Sometimes people may go a little bit overboard. So you're also going to want to make some choices in terms of levels of control that you still have in the learning environment. Now, for me personally, I work more in the formal learning environment, but also in a very small scale group environment. So typically my group size virtually is anywhere from 4 to about 15 or sometimes 25 if it's more of the corporate arena. I personally like to let it wide open. If someone wants to keep annotating, we're going to work around it. I've never had anyone abuse that privilege, but I do know of virtual facilitators who use annotation sparingly because they've had a very negative experience where someone has just started marking things up. But be aware of what your platform will allow for. And this is where, regardless of what platform you choose, you are going to want to do your due diligence and your own learning in terms of, what could I do to turn on or off annotation? Is this an appropriate time to introduce annotation? Earlier this morning, I had a final group call with a group that I started about a month ago. We've been using annotation consistently throughout the program. I've had people, instead of verbally check in by writing out or typing out sort of their successes in the week. We have a lot of kinesthetic learners in that group. And so we haven't used annotation because it's a large group size, but because it's people's preference. Annotation can be fun as well. I think I've shared in past calls, one of the things I like to do as a quick warm-up is welcome people to the call with a map that is relevant. So maybe it's the world, maybe it's North America. It really depends where my learners are from, but getting people to actually annotate where they're calling in from. And it's just a quick way to start connections, start helping people feel oriented, knowing that, hey, for me, it's like noon, and for someone else on the call, it might be 9 a.m. They might be starting off their day. Use annotation. I don't think we always use it, but if you're using a WebEx, if you're using a GoToWebinar, is there a way that you can actually be incorporating more annotation just to get people into the room? We know that we have such a limited window of connecting people not only with their WIFM, but with what's important for them in the learning process. A second interactivity consideration I think more of us use is, of course, the chat functionality. So whether you're on Skype or Zoom, GoToWebinar, Adobe Connect, chat is well used, I think, a lot of the time. We may use chat for bringing in questions. We may bring in chat for if we don't have a poll function, for example, having people answer questions. And again, keeping in mind, what is the level of interactivity? Do you want to post or put out verbally a question every 5 to 7 minutes to get input on? Chat is a great tool. Consider for yourself in your upcoming program that you were just thinking about, is there a way to sort of move the needle or boost up, amp up the chat functionality? A third one is ease of recording. And so unless you want to go and do a lot of video editing, some of the platforms I would say are a little, well, actually a lot of them have become very easy in terms of sending you the recording after the fact. If it's appropriate, if it's a more of a call like this, which is just going out to the wider community, Zoom does a terrific job. If I'm doing a WebEx, it automatically generates and sends back, and people who missed part of the call or all the call are able to catch up. Think about how important that is. Older or more original, perhaps is a word I should say, more original channels like Skype make it harder to do recordings. You have to do a lot of app interface rather than having the system immediately generate it for you. Think about the value of the recording, and as we might also see in a virtual environment, just make sure everyone knows that what they're saying is being recorded, especially if you are in a corporate arena. If you have an agreement around confidentiality as a coach, you've got to ask yourself or explore with the organization, if it is being recorded, who owns it, who has access to it, is it appropriate? You may not want to be recording calls if there's a confidentiality agreement from an ethics perspective. Two more considerations in choosing your platform, and again, notice that I'm not going into the nuances of this, but you'll have to do some thinking through things like, do we want to do video streaming and do we want to do screen sharing? And I think a lot of the time we have the death by PowerPoint mindset where it's like, oh, I'll just put the screen up and I'll just talk. I'll talk at it. I'll get people to just listen. But there is something to be said about having actual, interaction and being able to see your peers. My hope would be by perhaps a few months from now, when we get on these calls, maybe people do want to stream and see each other, although in today's world, I think most of us like to just learn in an anonymous way. And so video streaming can be a consideration. I know in my group and team coaching work, once again, Zoom sort of is heads and shoulders above the pack on this one in terms of allowing for stability and accessibility. And that is something I'm always looking at. I found originally I started a lot of my group coaching by Skype, but it was not as stable a platform as Zoom has found to be in the last couple of years, especially for people outside North America. And again, in a virtual domain, we want to think about where are people, how are they getting on the call, how are they accessing it? Basic consideration for a lot of these today is there a mobile app? And if people are calling in via their mobile, can we see them? Again, if you're doing a Zoom group call, you can have people in their vehicles, of course not driving, but parked in their vehicles. You may have people calling in from their office, their home office, and they can be on the main platform or they could be on a mobile platform. So really think about the app accessibility. I think if we do a comparison across different platforms, many of them do have the app or mobile function, but you'll definitely want to check that out before you do any investment. And I would say in checking it out, you'll want to pilot it. So if you are a corporate learning function or an entrepreneur leading virtual programming, really do a beta on this. See how easy it is, see how stable it is for people from different locations, because if the platform doesn't work, doesn't matter how good your call is, how interactive you want to be, this becomes really a difficult issue, a tricky issue for people who can't access a call at all. A final area in interactivity, of course, is the screen sharing. How easy is that? Are you proficient with it? Is it something easy you can use? So for yourself, you've probably already noted this, but I'd like you to just identify on your whatever notes you're taking today, what is the most important interactivity consideration for you? And just based on what you've heard, is there a platform you think might be more suited for you than others? Take 20 seconds to note that down. Now, I just flipped back forward into Appendix A just to see, is there anything else I should be noting here? Probably a couple of other things that I haven't even touched on in this presentation is like, what is your group size? Of course, there are certain platforms that have an upper threshold. Things like a group Skype call, you have 5 people, versus some of the conference call modalities, which allow for thousands of people, depending on the platform. So I would say under interactivity, in addition to all of these factors, you've of course got group size, and a final function, which I really haven't touched on too much today, is this, what are the platforms in which people are accessing it? Is it Mac? Is it Apple? Is it PC? And that may also be something that also impacts your platform choice. For many organizations, they're still back and utilizing as a primary their bridge lines. And I want to assert that even in the traditional bridge line environment, we can, mix it up. You could be asking questions every 7 minutes. Many of them, including on this list, I think it's freeconferencing.com, have breakout functionality. It does involve callers in hitting a few keys on their keypad, but you can move people within many of these bridge lines to smaller breakout groups. So I would assert, there's nothing worse than a Monday morning spent on conference call after conference call where you can't see people, you can't engage with people. If bridge lines still are your way to be communicating and you are involving people in meetings, and chances are for leaders today, it's up to 40% of their time, really be thinking about how you can create more visual anchor points. If you absolutely can't use any of these streaming technologies, if you can't do screen sharing, make sure that there's a handout people can refer to. Call on people every couple of minutes for more dialogue, and make sure you minimize the background noise. So there's a chainsaw going off. Hopefully it's not getting caught too much on this, but bridge line use is still going to stay. It's the most stable, it's the most inclusive for a lot of organizations, and from a security standpoint, that may be where organizations are at. I've included here 4 different ones that are quote unquote free. Now, in saying that they're free, they may be free to set up an account, but they usually aren't free for the user to access. So that also is something that I think is really important in any programming for the virtual facilitator, to let people know, here's what you need to do pre-programmed to set up, or this is what you'll need to have in place. 1, a stable landline, not a mobile line, because as soon as you're on bridge lines, what typically happens once you have mobiles in the mix is, of course, a lot of static. A key consideration if you're using bridge lines, do you know and are you providing instructions on how to, 1, mute and unmute yourself, and 2, as the leader of the call, are you recording it, and if so, what is the function pad on your platform? I would say one other quick tip on bridge lines, of course, that has served me well over the many years I've used bridge lines. If you are the facilitator, make sure you know how to mute and unmute all of the lines itself. I've always said, I don't like to do that, but in larger calls, call quality is essential. In any conference call quality is essential. And there's nothing worse than having a bad staticky connection. That, to me, has actually been, I think, one of the reasons why many of us have moved to other platforms, whether it's been a Skype platform or other. And I just wanted to sort of go through Skype because many Professionals, corporate and otherwise, are using Skype in some iteration, whether it's Skype for business or Skype personal. You really want to think with your groups, is it going to be video, non-video? How do I record it? And unfortunately, with this Skype personal, the video recording element is much more tricky. Historically on Skype, its group calls have typically been anywhere from 5 to 9. Again, that is possibly going to change, but you do want to also look at things like firewalls and accessibility. In fact, sometimes in some parts of the world, the person calling in may only be able to use Skype as their vehicle. So it's interesting, again, as we go to the global level, what is the platform of choice? For some group members, they may not be able to access a Zoom, but they can access a Skype. So for you as the virtual facilitator, how do you help people troubleshoot through this? How do you ensure that before the call, they need to check it out? And what do you do if you have a group of, say, 8 people, 7 of which can access Zoom, and 1 can only get on Skype? How are you going to manage that? And just very practically, one thing I'd say is this is where, and I talk about this in the book in chapter, it's probably chapter 6, Preparing for Blastoff, how important it can be to have multiple systems at any one time, especially for groups that are new. So this spring, I had a situation, not uncommon, happens to me maybe a couple times a year. We had everyone on Zoom except for one person who could not access Zoom the whole time. And for them, because of the country they were calling in from, their only virtual channel was Skype. So what I needed to do was every week bring them in via Skype, bring the others in via Zoom, and of course just be a little bit more creative in terms of how we were getting people to interact. So being very intentional in when they were reporting in, because it was a coaching group, reporting in, I would actually have a baby laptop, which I could hold up to this larger laptop and show the person. They could hear. The quality was enough that the group members could actually hear from them. But when we went to do breakouts, of course, they could not go into the breakout rooms. So as the facilitator, had to work with them. So Skype is great, and again, Skype may be the only platform. Since 2014, it was interesting to sort of go back, how many years have I been using Zoom? It's been more than 3 years, and really have found this to be a great platform of choice in terms of the recording, the screencasting, the accessibility via different devices. I work remote every summer, so for 6 months, I wish it was 6 months, 6 weeks of the year, Zoom is my platform. Doing conference-based calls, the line quality is, when I say it's like question mark on the landline, and on my mobile, it's absolutely out of the question. I can't get enough signal to actually do any mobile calls from up here because of all of the vegetation, all of the trees and vegetation around. So ultimately, and I've only highlighted these 3, Zoom, Skype, conference calls. Of course, there is a myriad of others, GoToWebinar, WebEx, Adobe Connect. Ultimately, we want to be thinking about, some of these considerations, whatever we're using. How are we going to engage people? Using chat. I haven't talked much about polls, but many platforms allow you to do polls where you can poll the audience. That's great when you have larger groups. Again, it's a way of getting quick real-time data for you, data for others, and you can show it, and it's fun. For smaller groups, probably groups of 50 or less, depending on the platform you're using breakouts. And I'll be further highlighting, breakouts, excuse me, in future sessions on how to make breakouts really work. Why I say you can use breakouts with groups of up to 50 or 100 if you have enough breakout rooms. Ultimately, you only want 3 to 5 people in most breakout environments, or else they will start to disconnect from each other. Some platforms as well have the use of emojis, and that's a great, quick tool to just take the pulse of a group. I've been using that a lot for a couple of years, getting people just before we break for lunch, perhaps, to just give me a quick show of emoji what their emotional level is. If you have a group of 12 or more, you quickly see where people are at. And I think it also, for professionals, it's still a fun way, but just keep noticing that one. There are 4 other considerations that will be the focus of other calls, those being pacing, the bottom one being brain-based research, and I touch on that a little bit in Chapter 4. I'll be doing more of a call on this in the coming months. And I think a really important thing to be considering is, where are we on the journey? How far along are we? And we're just about to come to the end of today's call. So I've been sort of taking a high-level overview, going above the waterline, or if we use the metaphor of roots versus leaves, really it's like looking at what are the leaves, what are the branches that are coming out. Underneath all of this, we want to be using these principles from today in terms of identifying what are the roots, what are the things that are going to help anchor the conversation. A final consideration is that usually your calls are not distinct, and you'll want to think about how do you connect people between calls. Are you using emails? Are you using learning management systems? Are you keeping people connected through Facebook groups, which is a really keen one? I wouldn't say keen, but more popular these days. But there's always considerations in terms of how you want to keep the conversation flowing and the communication going. So as we go to wrap this up, think about how you might make things more interactive and more interesting by using many of these different channels. Chapter 7 of the new book goes into almost all of these different areas, from maps to animation to pre and post work to using questions to storyboarding. We will do a future call on different activities, and they just jazz things up, right? It's like even after half an hour, notice how much information you can take in. So part of today, I hope, will be to track your steps and to know what is important for you. Today in the book, we've been zooming into more of Chapter 4, the ecosystem, and of course the appendix. If you've been tracking your steps, you may want to flip to Appendix B in the book, and it really does look like this. So there's the book version. You can also download a copy of this if you've purchased the book at effectivevirtualconversations.com on the downloads page. Of course, there is the code, which you'll find at the copy of the front of your book. And I hope that you're tracking some of the things you're committing for yourself to do in making more engaging calls for your group members. Couple of notes on upcoming programs. This is our last call for August. We're not back together again until September 11th, which is what's different and what's the same in virtual work. Our second community call will be held on September 25th on 6 activities, and both of those calls will be held at 11 to 11:30 Eastern on Mondays in this Zoom room. I'm also starting a couple of new groups for virtual learning. Of course, the Virtual Facilitation Essentials, that's a 5-week focus on the essentials of virtual facilitation. The fall session will also be a Monday group. It will, and the dates were just posted this morning. It'll start at 1:45 till 3 p.m. Eastern on Mondays, starting September 11th, running through to mid-October. And the dates for the longer 15-hour virtual train-the-trainer through the VFSI, the Virtual Facilitation Skills Intensive, those will start also in the fall. We're just trying to look at dates to get a couple participants from Europe as well as here in North America at the right time zone. So stay tuned at effectivevirtualconversations.com for that. For coaches, as always, mentor coaching groups, group coaching essentials, the advanced practicum, and of course the Learning Lab and Design Studio will continue in the fall. I will be off for the next couple of weeks, and I will look forward to connecting with all of you again in early September. Please stay tuned at effectivevirtualconversations.com. We've got a number of different things coming. I've started translating some of our tip blog posts into short videos. So for those that like videos, do check those out. They're not available yet, but those will start coming out this week. And as always, I want to say it was great to connect with you. Thanks for your time today. It's Jennifer Britton, and I hope to see you on September 11th for our next call, What's Different and What's the Same in Virtual Work. Have a great rest of your day and a good start to your week. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.